Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. This week we'll continue on with the technical aspects of sculpture and talk about casting. In this case, casting the king of the rusted crown in aqua or hydro-resin. If you haven't seen it already, there's a complete tutorial series on how this sculpture was made. There's a link to that series in the top right corner and below in the description. Like last week, we will cover the steps in chronological order, which means it's not necessarily the order in which things were done. So if there are some continuity issues and you notice them, don't be alarmed. It's just because I want to cover things in chronological order to make them a little bit more clear and a little bit more easy to follow, hopefully. As you'll notice throughout the video, I am covered up with a nice jean fabric apron that I got from mom and dad. This stuff gets very messy. Casting can get pretty messy, and the material I'm working with does not come off your clothes very easily. I'll also be wearing gloves, and I'm working in a large open studio with good air circulation. So you want to keep these things in mind for your own health and safety whenever you're casting something. Even with plaster, which does produce dust, you want to think about these things. Okay, let's dive right into it. First things first, I have to mix the resin. Now I start off with a clean mold, and it's laying open, by the way, as you can probably tell. So there's no clay or any dust or anything left in the mold. The resin is very easy to mix. They recommend a 2:1 powder to liquid mix ratio, and it doesn't really matter if you add the powder into the liquid or whatever way you do it. It's very flexible in that manner. I prefer to add the powder, just like I do with plaster, just because it's easier to remember. Personally, I never really followed the 2:1 powder to liquid mix ratio that closely, and I just mix until the consistency is right for the job at hand. I use cheap plastic salad bowls that I get from our lovely local Esselunga to mix the stuff in. This stuff, the resin, sticks like crazy to anything, so it's best to mix it in something that's disposable, something you don't really care about. I have a bucket of water right next to me because this is not really resin. It's not, synthetic resin. It's hydro-resin or aqua resin, or in England I think they call it jesmonite. They're all the same thing, and what they are is essentially plaster. Enhanced plasters are what they're called. They're synthetic hard plaster powder mixed with acrylic liquid. It's water soluble just like acrylic paint, so you can clean all your tools with water, which is very handy. And this also means that this stuff doesn't stink up the joint, and it's fairly easy to use, not very damaging to your health to work with. So it's a very, very good material, but it does come at a cost. It is quite expensive. Once the resin is mixed, I apply it with a brush to the inside of my mold. As you can see, the consistency of the resin is around that of a thin Nutella, or perhaps melted ice cream, freshly melted ice cream, not thinly melted ice cream, perhaps Italian ice cream, gelato, melted gelato, or something like that. Now the reason I mix it to this thickness is because this ensures that it stays in place where I put it, but it's thin enough not to catch air bubbles. So as you can see, my mold is kind of shaped like a half pipe or a bowl, and up against the sides of the bowl I don't want my resin to be running down and me having to chase it to make sure that I get an even thickness. This thickness to the resin also means that it sets up or hardens in a decent amount of time. The amount of powder added will affect the setting time. More powder means that the resin will harden faster. Usually it seems to be around 45 minutes, but it can be quite a bit longer if your mix is thin. So this is another reason why I don't mix it so thin. Once you get very good at this, you can adjust the setting time by feel instead of measuring it out or anything like that. I never really measure it out. I just adjust it by feel, by how it feels when I mix it. And because of all of this, the material is super flexible. It will almost always harden up on you, which is lovely, and again, probably the reason why it's so damn expensive. As I mentioned, I want to avoid pooling. That's because I want pooling at the bottom of the mold. That's because I want even coverage, even thickness of this first splash coat and any other coat for that matter, and this helps avoid warping or any spots on the cast once we pull this out of the mold that will be really heavy, which will throw the balance off when the figure is mounted, which is something you want to avoid. Imagine like the figure falling on people in the gallery or something like that because the head is full of resin. I don't know. You want to make sure that doesn't happen. Now I'm honestly not 100% sure if this resin does warp, but I always find that with any material, it's always better just to make sure that you have even coverage, just in case. It's better to be safe than sorry, always. To get the resin into the mold a little quicker, I pour some in to begin with, and then I work from that little pool inside my mold and pull the resin with my brush around inside the mold. I'm careful to not get any, or at least not a lot, on the edges or too close to the seams, because I want to keep the edges clean, because if the edges get messy with resin, it will be harder to fit the two halves of the mold back together. But if the edge is clean, it will be really easy, and I can put resin around the seam where the two halves meet once I've closed the mold by sticking my hand up inside the mold. Now this part is obviously extremely straightforward. Just make sure the mix is not too thin, because then you'll be chasing it up the sides of your mold forever, which is very annoying. Make sure you don't get any pooling, and make sure that you get resin everywhere, essentially. Pretty easy. For this mold, because of the crown, which is very hard to get to because it's quite thin, so it's hard to get a brush down in there, I tilted the mold upright like you see right here, and I poured it solid. I tipped the mold up against my table, and then I just poured liquid resin into the crown and didn't worry about getting fiberglass or anything in there. As you can see, I made a bit of a mess doing this, but I can clean that up later. It's just always better to avoid making a mess, but it was kind of unavoidable in this case. You can also see here how the resin changes color once it dries. It becomes more of a brown rather than a grayish purple, and this is a great indicator if it's time for the next coat. If the resin turns brown, you can start on the next layer, whatever that layer may be. The hands gotta get done too. They're a bit finicky because I don't have a small brush, but you can use your fingers and clean up the edges if you mess up. Or you can just use a smaller brush. Now this is just a brush I happen to have at hand, and I was too lazy to go to the hardware store for a smaller brush. I'm very careful with the hands because they're so thin and narrow to not build up too much resin, as this can interfere when attaching the two halves together. I don't go over the edge of the mold. If you work in a messy fashion, it becomes very hard to keep track of what is the edge of your mold and what is figure. So work as clean as possible. It will help you get a lot better results. And always stay away from the edge, especially in small areas like hands, because we'll add resin into the mold when we close it, and that's when we will fill up that last little bit of the edge. This, I think, would be a good time to mention Patreon. If you're interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or via video chat, my Patreon is the place for you. You'll get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. You'll also get 25% off on my web store, plus accumulated credits equal to the amounts you pledge that can be used for further discounts in the web store. So check it out. There's a link in the description below. Once the first layer dries, I give everything a second layer. This batch of resin is a little thicker than the first one. The second layer serves to thicken the splash coat and to soften out any lumps and bumps that will interfere with the next step, which is laying down the fiberglass. The type of fiberglass I get here in Florence is it's a very open weave, and it doesn't lay down very well over sharp edges and bumps. It has a tendency to be a little too stiff, even when wet with resin. So another splash coat to soften out as many hard edges as possible and make the terrain inside the mold as even as possible is very helpful and makes for less chasing of rogue fiberglass. Before I even begin, I've already cut the fiberglass into squares or rectangles that will fit my sculpture. Cutting fiber while laying them down I think is a very bad idea. It usually turns into a mess, your resin sets up on you, you get rushed, your scissors gets caked in resin, which will in turn flay your knuckles. Just trust me, it's a bad idea. So the fiber is pre-cut. Get a good pair of scissors and try not to rip and tear the fiber, as this kicks up fiberglass dust. You can wear a mask if you want, and definitely wear gloves. Nothing is more annoying than tiny pieces of fiberglass stuck in between your fingers. Fiber only bends one way, so I do keep track of which way that is, so I know where the fiber will lay down nicely inside my mold. If I'm laying fiber down along a wall, I want it to follow the curve of the wall, and so, or as we mentioned earlier, like the edge of a bowl, we want it to follow the curve of the bowl, and so knowing which direction it bends is really helpful. I mix a new batch of resin. This one is a little bit thinner again, and I brush in a fresh coat where my fiber is about to be laid down, kind of as a splash coat, so there's resin underneath the fiberglass as well. Then I wet out the fiber on top of a disposable piece of plastic, so I don't mess up my table too much. You can also use aluminum foil. I wet the fiber on both sides and tamp it down into the mold using my hands first and then my brush to make sure that there's no air bubbles. For a cast with this material, you only need one layer of fiber, but it's important to make sure that every single piece of fiber overlap each other. This ensures a very, very strong mold. And I'm still staying away from the edges even when laying in the fiber, making sure that it's a nice and clean edge that will register well with the other half of the mold down the line. As I said before, I will paint resin onto this edge once the mold is closed, and I'll also lay fiberglass over the top of this edge to lock the two pieces of the two halves of the mold back together. The hands were very difficult, and I had to cut a lot of tiny pieces to fit inside the hands and fingers. But it's essentially the very same thing, it's just a lot more time consuming. And again, I think a smaller brush would have helped, but I didn't have one. And because of that, I did make a bit of a mess while I was doing this, and I did actually have to go back with a Dremel tool and clean up the edges and find the edges in certain places, which you can avoid by working cleaner than what I did here. For the second half of the mold, I decided to try something a little different. I splash coated the mold first, and then I laid dry fiber into the mold, into my splash coat, without wetting out the fiber. Now the fiber stuck to the splash coat and was locked into place, but stayed dry at the top. Then I mixed a new batch of resin, fairly thin, and I soaked the fiber. I'm not sure which techniques works best though. They both worked fine, though I think maybe doing it this way is a little bit less messy, which I really liked. And I think I perhaps prefer this way. It's a little less stressful as well because the fiber is dry, so it's easy to make adjustments with the cut and it's easy to find a good spot for them to fit. You have to make sure that once the fiber is laid down, you get it nice and wet using this method, being very careful to tamp out any air bubbles and get resin into all the nook and crannies of the fiber. Any air pocket or holes will become fragile and will very easily be broken once the cast gets out of the mold. So essentially the surface of your cast will just be a thin shell with fiber behind it, but it's not going to be solid essentially. It'll have air holes behind it, and the fiber at that point really serves no purpose. So making sure you drench the fiber well and get it properly soaked in resin is important. Obviously, no reason to go completely crazy. We still don't want a super heavy cast, and we want to avoid pooling, which can lead to warps or a strangely balanced cast that will fall on people that come to look at our sculptures, which is never a good thing. You want to avoid sculptures falling on people in general. Keep in mind that it's not the amount of resin that makes the strength of the mold, it's really the fiberglass. Okay, so this is it for part 1. The video, I was editing it and it ended up being quite long already, and I really want to show you guys as much as possible without just cutting things really short and without making a 45-minute video. And the only way for me to do this is to split the video up into several shorter videos. Well, they're still not short, but you know what I mean. So next time we'll tackle the cleaning of the seams and the closing of the mold and filling the seams when the mold is closed, and locking the two halves together using fiberglass. And perhaps we'll get to open it too. Depends on how long the edit ends up being. So thank you for staying patient, and please let me know if splitting videos like this into series is something that you prefer or not. Next week we're back with another part of the PT video series, so stay tuned for that. I hope you're excited. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, the thumbs up, and share it with your friends and family. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.